On April 3rd, 1924, the Chicago police arrested a young woman in a drunken stupor. She had frantically called her husband a few hours prior, claiming a man had entered their home and attempted to assault her. She had no choice but to defend herself, she asserts, as the man's lifeless body lay on the floor. He kept coming toward me. There was nothing else for me to do. However, when asked why there was a bullet hole in the man's back as if he had rushed toward her, the alleged victim decided in that moment to faint. It wasn't until they took her in for questioning that the woman, a wide-eyed 23-year-old named Beulah Annan, began unraveling the truth. "I'd been fooling around with Harry for 2 months," she finally admitted. He had come over to share a drink with her before a heated argument took place. She had accused him of seeing other women, and in an attempt to trigger a jealous outburst, declared she had been seeing other men herself. In a fit of rage, she claimed both her and her lover looked toward the bedroom where her husband's gun was stored. "But I was ahead of him," Beulah professed. When the police asked if the man went to get his coat and hat, she said, "No, he didn't get that far." When asked why, she simply responded, "Darn good reason. I shot him." News of the incident broke headlines across Chicago, the story of a seemingly innocent wife shooting her lover in a crime of passion. How could such a dainty, vulnerable, and most of all, beautiful young woman do such a terrible thing? The papers documented every detail of her case as she stood trial, her latest confessions of shame and regret, her picture-perfect attire as she took the stand, how she was manipulated by the wrong man, how pitiful she looked as she dramatically recounted the incident, how pretty she was as she posed for photographs in her jail cell. When news broke of yet another woman convicted of killing her lover, Beulah gathered the press and changed up her story. This time, she claimed her boyfriend attacked her because she was carrying her husband's child. Reporters happily ate up each twist and scandal, spinning her crime into one of a tragic love story. Crowds treated her case like the latest episode of a soap opera, and Beulah thrived, looking picture-perfect as ever on the front pages. This woman wasn't just a criminal. She was a celebrity. But Beulah's infamy wasn't the earliest of its kind, nor the most notable or gruesome. Media circuses surrounding criminals, murder cases, and cold-blooded killers have long been a thing since the modern newspaper first came into the fray. 19th century London's Jack the Ripper became one of the first, most notorious instances of a killer gaining widespread attention and, eventually, legendary status. He was known for primarily targeting women, typically sex workers around the slums of London's East End, brutally attacking and mutilating them. Though the exact number of murders linked to his case remain unknown, women by the name of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Mary Jane Kelly, and Catherine Eddowes were all considered to be the canonical 5 victims of his modus operandi. His notoriety had him constantly dominate the headlines between 1888 and 1891, haunting the public consciousness of England and, eventually, the rest of the world. And his actual identity remains a mystery to this day, with some researchers even putting forth a recent theory that the Ripper could have very well been a woman, likely a midwife with anatomical knowledge. But it was this very enigma around his persona and motives that turned him into a focal point of not only fear, but fascination in the media. Museums wasted no time depicting his crimes through wax figure displays, scenes that a local magistrate reportedly called revolting in the extreme. There was the rise of dark tourism around his murder sites, such as the yard where Annie Chapman was attacked, where visitors were charged a penny each to enter the area. The media didn't hesitate to sensationalize his murder methods, with the London press eagerly highlighting, quote, clinical details of bodily injuries that Victorian newspapers served up to readers in an almost pornographic manner. And when the media couldn't get their hands on the latest Ripper news, well, they made them up. In her study of Fanlike engagement and its practices, Judith May Fathallah writes, in November 1894, the Gazette published several macabre stories, one of which consisted of a long letter written by Jack the Ripper's pal. Perhaps most fascinatingly of all, in 1894, the sensationalist newspaper The Sun actually managed to publish the first Ripper fanfic. Pitched as a piece of investigative journalism, an anonymous staff reporter known only as WK supposedly traced the real Ripper to Broadmoor, an asylum for the criminally insane, and promised to extract his final confession exclusively for the Sun. This is a real, verifiable historical example of a first-person fictional narrative in which our hero meets a real-life serial killer, a genre that dominates the serial killer fanfic on Wattpad to this day. It helped that at the time, mainstream news was readily accessible and rapidly distributed through cheap, disposable newspapers. Their theatrical fixation on the mystery and morbidity around Jack the Ripper, coupled with the swift dissemination of police reports, personal accounts, and hearsay, turned the killer into a bona fide celebrity, intentional or otherwise. Everyday citizens even try to play a part in his narrative, with many visiting his scenes of crime in order to get closer to the story or even making street art of his murders. But probably the most fascinating practice was the act of almost fanatical roleplay some people took part in. The most notable of these being the hundreds of Ripper letters claiming to be from the killer. One of these, the infamous Dear Boss letter, gave Jack the Ripper his name, as the writer signed off with it and threatened even more murders. This, along with most other messages, were believed to be an elaborate hoax penned by local journalists. Then there were the men who'd engage in Ripper baiting, where they dress in feminine clothes in an attempt to lure and catch the Ripper in likely areas around Whitechapel. Others would straight up claim to be the killer or go as far as to hail his operation a gratifying one, threatening to, as Fathallah writes in her essay, do for women of their acquaintance the same as Jack the Ripper had done for others, some night when she little thinks of it. To this day, plenty of discussion remains around the Ripper's true identity. Documentaries continue to be churned out by the dozen, and nearly every serial killer of women have been compared to him since. He was also a pioneering figure for plenty more celebritized mass murderers to come. A con artist by the name of H.H. Holmes soon after became America's first famous serial killer, most known for owning a hotel dubbed the Murder Castle, where most of his kills apparently took place. When finally captured, he happily took advantage of his notoriety. The man seemed very aware of his sensationalized status in the papers and wasted no time milking it, not only confessing to a total of 27 murder victims, but also publishing his own account of his crimes. In an effort to craft an even more chilling yet memorable public image, he also claimed that his facial features were transforming to resemble Satan. The public ran with all the morbid lore and urban legends surrounding him, with many going on to grossly exaggerate his crimes and body count for years to come. American Horror Story would even go on to pay homage to him, starring Evan Peters, who we will see again later on in this video. The celebrity criminal phenomenon only picked up greater steam by the time the 20s rolled around, of which the aforementioned Beulah Anand became a well-known face for. She wasn't alone in her exploits, however. A woman by the name of Belva Gertner shared the spotlight during Beulah's time on trial, a 38-year-old cabaret singer who was arrested for killing her own husband. Both were seen as the glamorous girls of Murderess Row, a section of Chicago's Cook County Jail that held the women awaiting trial for murder. Unlike the other female inmates, Beulah and Belva each had their own way of charming the public. It was as if every time there were cameras, they had a certain performance and set of quips at the ready. Journalist Maureen Watkins, who famously covered their trials, noted that Belva, in particular, had a way of pulling perfect, headline-worthy witticisms for reporters, while Beulah knew just how to play the role of the innocent, doe-eyed victim. And it worked every time. People couldn't get enough of Chicago's most beautiful slayer and the most stylish woman of the Cook County cell block. Even in her efforts to cast a more critical light on these killers, Watkins found that her front-page stories of Beulah and Belva only increased the public's adoration. It got to a point where Beulah was even receiving gifts, roses, and love letters from men across the country. With a carefully crafted press image, the women's defense teams tugged at the jury's heartstrings, all the way to the verdict of not guilty. Beulah, in particular, garnered empathy points by playing the role of a virtuous working woman and a loving wife, a victim of slander and manipulated by a drunken maniac. Belva didn't quite have as much of a sob story, but she did charm the court with her classy demeanor. At one point, the assistant state attorney even asked one of the jurors, "Would you let a stylish hat make you find her not guilty?" Whether that actually had an influence, at the end of it all, their efforts to razzle-dazzle the public and justice system clearly paid off. In his 2010 book, The Girls of Murder City, Douglas Perry notes that a lot of this was also linked to the sexism and racial bias at the time. Women, especially those who were white and attractive, weren't seen as capable of being cold-blooded killers by all male juries. It's worth noting that the charity given to Beulah and Belva was never extended to people like Sabella Nitti, another Cook County inmate who, unlike the former two, was older, poorer, and an Italian immigrant who could barely speak English. The press were unnecessarily cruel in describing her, portraying her as ugly, animal-like, and dirty, despite being one of the cleanest members of the cell block. Things took a dark turn when she was eventually sentenced to hang for the murder of her husband, a case based on reportedly unproven evidence that was even far lacking to that of Beulah and Belva's defense. But with the stigma surrounding her looks, race, and socioeconomic status, Sabella was an easy target to make an example out of, and the prosecution was desperate for a win, what with all these other pretty women walking free. It wasn't until the help of a female lawyer named Helen Cerise that she was given a makeover, taught to speak English, and had her case appealed until charges were dropped altogether. Having the right image helped. Sabella went from being called an animal in the papers to being called a butterfly by Forbes, and managed to build a substantial amount of nationwide support. The circus around sensationalized crimes, this appalling leniency given to attractive criminals, and the fact that the killers themselves prospered through such grotesque fame was such a fascinating phenomenon for journalist Watkins that she eventually created a stage play based off of the Cook County cases throughout her career. The play, titled Chicago, was eventually adapted into one of Broadway's longest-running musical shows to date, which was then adapted into a 2002 Academy Award-winning movie of the same name, starring Renee Zellweger and Catherine Zeta-Jones. All versions featured searing satirical commentary on American society's twisted melding of celebrity culture and real-life crimes, along with the role of its flawed justice system. We see its two killer leads, based off of Beulah and Belva, glamorously lie, entertain, and seduce the presses, and in a rather on-the-nose, cynical finale, we find them continuing to win the hearts of the public as full-on media stars, thanking their fans for their undying belief in them throughout it all. And well, I guess things haven't really changed much. But just before we get into the next bit, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Milanote. So as I'm editing this video, I'm actually already working on the next one, and content creation, or really any creative project, especially when you're in the beginning stages of it, can be quite the challenge. When I get excited or passionate about an idea, I tend to get 1,000 hyperactive thoughts just running through my brain, and because I don't want to lose track of any of them, I need a quick, structured way of just organizing them all out in front of me. And honestly, Milanote has been a godsend on that front. It's a free organizational tool for any creative project you may be working on, acting as a sort of canvas that allows you to visually plan out what you hope to achieve and what your next steps are in any given project. You start off by creating what's called a board, which you can then turn into whatever visual planner you see fit through one of the over 100 templates available across multiple creative fields. So whether you're in marketing, in film, in game design, or even just a student looking to organize their assignments, this app has a tailored visual way of helping you structure your ideas. Personally, I'm of course using this tool for content creation. Here's a little sneak peek of the next video that I'm doing, organized into multiple boards. I've got one for collating all of my research, and another one I've used as a simple mood board to help me decide on what my video aesthetic or costume should look like. I like how you can add notes to yourself and little extra visuals as you go. As you can see, I did a bunch of doodles here and there. Really helps in organizing everything in a way that makes sense and is appealing to you. You can also choose to add different forms of media like music and even videos to help you out with your brain dump. It's honestly perfect for a creator like me that can often get lost in the sauce of video research and visual editing. This really helps me map out my brain onto the screen. And of course, you also don't have to be organizing these boards all on your own. If you want to, you could also collaborate with other creatives in real time by sharing your board with a simple link. Now, Milanote is available for free with no time limit. So if you feel like this is something that could help you out with your projects too, then you can sign up for a free account with the link in my description. Now on to the next title card.
I know that he's a nice person because I've met him, and I know.
He's convicted of 13 murders.
I know. But he's a really nice guy.
So by now, I'm pretty sure we've all heard about serial killers and their twisted legions of unironic fangirls. The 70s actually seemed to shift the way media would characterize notorious male murderers in particular. Instead of merely depicting them as monsters and real-life horror sensations, the more modern angle was to highlight how they were also strangely handsome and charming if the bill fits. And given the influence of mainstream media, they'd become exactly that for many members of the public, with some becoming full-on fanatics even. Most of us already know that Ted Bundy was essentially the poster child for this phenomenon, a man who abducted, raped, and murdered dozens of young women across 7 different states in America, and yet developed loyal groupies as if he was, in the most grotesque sense of the idea, some kind of rock star. And much of this is owed to the fact that the press couldn't stop highlighting how he was unusually charismatic, intellectually brilliant, and most importantly, handsome for someone who killed people, which I guess led many impressionable citizens to believe that maybe he just never killed at all. One of his supporters was even quoted saying,
"He just doesn't look like the type to kill somebody. He just doesn't look like the type to kill somebody."
There was also, of course, Carol Ann Boone, who was his most vocal defender at the time, wholeheartedly convicted in her belief that he wasn't a murderer. She actually testified that he was a kind, warm, and patient man, and never saw anything in Ted that indicates any destructiveness towards any other people whatsoever. And then she infamously married Bundy smack dab in the middle of a court hearing, and a few years later gave birth to his child. Thankfully, just 3 years before the psycho was sent to the electric chair, Boone divorced him, cutting ties with the killer and the media circus surrounding him since. What Boone and many others who pined over Bundy experienced is known as the halo effect, this cognitive bias that makes us judge another positively based on a single trait. In the case of the criminals we've discussed so far, this trait is often good looks or perceived charisma. Serial killer, and all-around abhorrent human being, Richard Ramirez, was similarly treated like some media heartthrob in the 80s by dozens of female admirers nationwide. Comments about this piece of shit echoed that of Bundy's supporters. "He's kind, he's funny, he's charming, he's cute. I know he's a nice person," one even stated, as if false bravado and being not ugly is enough to excuse the fact that he's battered, assaulted, and brutally mutilated numerous people, including children. Here's a much more recent and much less serious non-murder related case, but in 2014, the social media age had a notable taste of this when convicted felon Jeremy Meeks gained an insane amount of traction after his mugshot was uploaded online, with loads of women finding him attractive and even giving him the Twitter hashtag #FelonCrushFriday. The fanaticism ranged from comments like, "If your heart was a prison, I would like to be sentenced for life," to thousands in donations towards his mother's crowdfunding page, Free Jeremy Meeks. But it didn't even stop there. The guy was eventually given a 27-month sentence, but received a modeling contract while still in prison, and all within 5 years of his release, made his runway debut for the Philipp Plein 2017 winter collection, collaborated with Gigi Hadid for Milan Fashion Week, launched a fashion line in his name, and even acted in a few TV movies. So it's amazing how forgiving people can be if you were just really ridiculously good looking. And for those who actually fall for or crush on these criminals, this superficial appeal feeds into the whole "I can fix them" mindset. The idea that perhaps they're just lost or troubled, and with a little nurturing and understanding, they could be changed men. According to his ex-girlfriend Elizabeth Kendall, Bundy would take full advantage of this. He would often put on a vulnerable, innocent victim act, frequently crying to Kendall about how he'd never met his real father. Maintaining this pitiful image kept her distant from the fact that he was indeed a man capable of killing women and getting away with it. It's interesting how those who actually knew Bundy in person basically debunked what news reports said about him. Years after his trial, a woman by the name of Anne Rule confirmed that Ted was never as handsome, brilliant, or charismatic as crime folklore has deemed him. A virtual non-entity before he was suspected of a series of horrific crimes, he somehow became all of those things as the media embraced him. His defense attorney Polly Nelson asserted that he started off as a rather insecure person who later devolved into a demanding narcissist. She added that he got away with his crimes by keeping a low profile, not because he, quote, was such a diabolical genius that he could fool you. Believe me, he was not that smart. And if all that wasn't enough, Bundy even admitted himself, "I became an expert at projecting something very different. It is clear now, I think, that a huge part of my life was hidden from everyone, secret as it were. it didn't take much effort at all. Sheila Eisenberg, author of Women Who Love Men Who Kill, also theorized that much of the women who fall for serial killers may have been abused in past relationships, and so have been conditioned to seek out troubled or problematic relationships in romantic partners. If all they've known was a toxic or abusive home, then they may have, unfortunately, been modeled to see this as normal or subconsciously even desirable in a partner due to its familiarity. Its challenges might have been warped as something that adds excitement to the romance. Even worse is if they also struggle with low self-worth, making them subconsciously feel undeserving of an actually happy, healthy relationship. The idea of being with a criminal not only feeds these psychological tendencies, but also presents itself as thrilling or exciting, with the many dangerous aspects involved. This could be coupled with an underlying fear of intimacy. Pursuing killers behind bars allows one to live out the fantasy of a romance without having to experience actual physical or sexual contact and/or abuse. This fantasy is also someone whose whereabouts you know all the time, and unlike sending fan mail to your favorite boy band member or movie star, he's also someone who's bored or lonely enough to offer you constant attention or communication. Women who've been previously abused may even feel like they can finally be in control of a relationship by being in this situation. They may feel like they're in a unique position of power since their inmate partner seems reliant on their companionship, and they get to choose when to visit or write to them. It's a fantasy world they've built for themselves where they can revel in this ideal, fanfiction-esque romance with a dangerous figure without having to face the realities of an actual relationship, or the crimes they've committed for that matter. But falling for serial killers isn't wholly exclusive to women. It can happen to men too. I mean, what with all the killer women in the 20s charming their all-male juries all the way to walking free. And in fact, the most extreme of these cases may fall under what's known as hybristophilia, a condition that involves having sexual interest in someone specifically for the fact that they commit heinous crimes. While most women diagnosed with this paraphilia typically only harbor romantic fantasies or arousal towards their subjects, men who have this, although rarer, tend to experience a more active or aggressive version of this condition, where they actually go on to assist the criminal in committing their crimes. Most of the time, though, when it comes to guys who gravitate towards serial killers or murderers, it's usually more of a platonic attraction. Typically, these men would relate to the perceived values of same-sex offenders, ideologically drawn to their character and what they stand for, or at least what they believe they stand for. The Columbine shooters had these very types of supporters, thanks in no small part to the widespread, sensationalized narrative of them being marginalized, bullied teens who only sought revenge against the oppressive jocks of Columbine High. This was courtesy of misinformed news cycles at the time, which still persist today on social media, although it's long been debunked, and that, in truth, the gunmen simply wanted to kill and leave a tragic legacy. But those who did believe this eventually gave way to copycats inspired by these fictional motives, disaffected men who have gone on to carry out their own school shootings while referencing the Columbine murderers. Or take Elliot Rodger, the infamous incel who went on to murder 6 people due to his frustration with being a virgin, and who unfortunately struck a chord with the deeply misogynistic fringe communities who enjoy putting all the blame on women for the difficulties of the dating scene. In the wake of this tragedy, and even in years after, there were an alarming number of dudes online who sought to celebrate and even justify his crime, with one even hailing Rodger as a saint before going on to kill 11 women in his own murder spree, stating his actions were part of the incel rebellion. He too was commended by the same groups, with one netizen even stating, "I hope this guy wrote a manifesto because he could be our next new saint." And what's scarier still are the killers who could captivate active followers of both men and women. Charles Manson did just that, forming an actual murder cult in the 60s who went on to commit various killing sprees on his command, one of the most prolific victims being pregnant actress Sharon Tate and her associates. Though they were eventually caught, the entire ordeal was, unsurprisingly, an absolute media spectacle. And whether the press were actually aware of it or not, Manson absolutely thrived on the attention and used it to his advantage. Rolling Stone even made him one of their front cover photos, inadvertently portraying him as the rock star he always wanted to be. He was an aspiring and failed LA musician before ultimately deciding to become a full-time cult-leading maniac. He was also invited to television interviews alongside other famous personalities, where he further fed the fascination of the public with his strange and often and disturbing persona, and he donned the character of an anti-authoritarian rebel with a passionate pro-environmental stance, leading many to see him as a supposed symbol of counterculture. It didn't help that in the wake of his high-profile murders, certain outlets would apparently focus more on the free-spirited lifestyle and activities of his commune rather than the terrors they inflicted. In fact, according to a Guardian article, one Rolling Stone reporter began his editorial on Manson with the belief that he had been framed, a poor hippie guru picked on by the authorities. Even the magazine's editor at the time initially planned on headlining the story with "Manson is innocent." Thankfully, with enough research, said reporter soon realized just how guilty Manson truly was of his crimes, and they eventually changed the cover heading to "The Most Dangerous Man Alive." As Robert Altman writes in his thesis of Manson's twisted allure, the man successfully bastardized a culture founded on peace, equality, and love into a framework of death, manipulation, and destruction. His cell would be flooded with fan letters defending his innocence and admiring his supposedly enlightened philosophies and ideals, mainly from those experiencing the very same alienation he sought to exploit, who were caught up by whatever misinformed narratives or mythologies surrounded his character. And I just want to bring up one final case study, but if you wanted a bit of romance to spice up the illusion of anti-government freedom fighters, well, Bonnie and Clyde had that package. Now classic figures in American crime folklore, the two gained notoriety for burgling small-time stores and causing multiple killings in their wake, but have since been famously reframed as pop culture's badass bandits who were simply sticking it to the man. Bonnie Parker particularly captured the media as the cigar-smoking hellcat of the Roaring 30s, since gun-slinging female bandits back then were few and far between. And of course, there was their love story, portrayed as not only action-filled and exciting, but the true definition of "till death do us part." Literally, the two were shot to death in their car, or rather, showered with bullets, once the authorities caught up to them one fateful day. Since people were so fascinated by the story surrounding them, their funerals garnered tens of thousands of attendees, with people everywhere sending flowers to their graves. The largest floral tribute apparently came from a group of newsboys who managed to sell 500,000 newspapers headlining their death in Dallas alone. And even in death, the media couldn't get enough of them. There soon came a crime film in 1958 titled The Bonnie Parker Story, portraying Parker as a glamorous, cigar-chomping femme fatale, and another movie in 1967 named Bonnie and Clyde that essentially did the same thing and was heavily criticized for glorifying their romance while downplaying how awful their crimes truly were. And I get it, the whole concept of lovers on the run is thrilling in, say, a Tarantino-style film, but the act of directly glamorizing two very real people who terrorize the nation feels strange, to say the least, when you think about it. And despite how they've been portrayed in popular media since, they weren't nearly as tough or alluring as they were made out to be in the public imagination. In fact, it's funny how so many of their fans at the time had their own fanfic fantasies of what they looked like, and when they actually saw the two in person at the scene of their death, were reportedly disappointed by what they saw. Bonnie wasn't some tall, glammed-up Hollywood-like siren, and Clyde was no Clint Eastwood. According to author Jeff Gwynne, one onlooker, disappointed by Clyde's scrawny frame, announced he was nothing but a little bitty fart. And it makes me wonder, if they had a clearer idea of their actual image, would they have been idolized as much as they were? This takes me back to the whole issue of being unnecessarily charitable to stone-cold killers based on their looks and physical appeal alone. Which brings me to the increasingly popular trend of the flashy, highly profitable, and progressively cursed genre of romanticized, cool, or relatable villains is nothing new in media. Some of the best films, TV shows, and video games feature deranged yet highly memorable and, dare I say, even likable psychopaths. Sometimes they'll even feature as romantic leads. Think of all the Bonnie and Clyde-esque couples we've seen in countless movies, or the dark and dangerous I can fix them love interests. There are times when these characters are even the forefront of their own story, often an anti-hero underdog with a sympathetic backstory beneath their sinister exterior. murder. And it's not uncommon for those with this arc to actually redeem themselves of their crimes, to show that they can in fact be good, despite everything they've been through. It helps, of course, that most of the time, these characters are often good-looking or charming or carry a lot of already likable personality traits, or a combination of all three. It places their otherwise unsavory personas in roles that make us want to empathize with them and their reasons for doing what they do. And there are times when they aren't justifiable, and directors can only hope that their audiences are able to appreciate a villain's story without necessarily having to root for them. Just because a character is the lead doesn't necessarily mean they're moral, in the right, or a hero by any means. I definitely didn't find myself idolizing Walter White or Tony Soprano or Nucky Johnson by the end of their series, but that doesn't mean I didn't find them to be incredibly compelling characters regardless. Sometimes their story is simply meant to be a morality tale. Of course, all this also depends on the direction and how well the story portrays its intended message, but whether they're a dark character study or the brooder with a heart of gold, at the end of the day, we're still just dealing with fictional characters. So what happens when you apply these very same practices and audience response to real-life criminals and murder cases? You might just get this. And I just want to be clear, I'm not saying that film or TV adaptations surrounding real-life killers or murder cases shouldn't be made at all. In fact, there are a few of these very projects out there that are actually really well done. But given how we are dealing with the lives and stories of actual people here, not just the killers in question, but those they've affected, it's an incredibly sensitive territory that I think should be handled with a lot more care than we usually see, especially when it comes to the whole entertainment first, ethics later approach that Hollywood tends to flex often. And so plenty of these works just come off exploitative of the real-life traumas they're depicting, while also risking painting their murderous subjects with more sympathy than they deserve. The Netflix series I Am a Killer, which isn't even a docudrama but an actual documentary series, was criticized for this very approach, quite literally. The concept of the show is to present its cases primarily through the viewpoint of the killers themselves through first-hand interviews. And when she learned that her stepson's murder would be featured on one of its episodes, Mindy Pendleton literally begged the producers through not one, but a series of emails to reconsider the project. Despite her pleas, they went ahead with it anyway. Her stepson, Robert Mast, was only 25 when he was strangled to death by his killer. And in the show's attempt to highlight her side of the story, cast her in a more victimized light by highlighting the fact she suffered from an abusive relationship years before the act, and that her crime was done out of a deep love for Mast. Call me crazy, this might be a hot take, but I just don't think these cold-blooded killers should be given a $1 million platform to air out some sob story, especially when said killer literally says in the same episode how she also wanted to know what it felt like to kill a person with her bare hands. The thing about turning real-life crimes into entertainment is you're then pressured to not just recount the facts, but also tell a good story. I mean, I did start off this video with a dramatic opening of a 1920s crime case, so I'm very well aware of the format. And in my opinion, that's not an inherently bad thing, as long as the facts, of course, take precedence over sheer entertainment and spectacle. But many come to find that the dollars lie in crime stories, playing off tried and true tropes in murder mystery fiction. The drawn-out suspense, the clear and cathartic resolutions, and a compelling, oftentimes sympathetic, lead character, which, in real life, isn't always how these cases go down. So we can see why these serial killer adaptations will often take on the format of a sensational, cinematic villain origin story, because it makes for more emotionally gripping theatrics despite making the murderer a compelling and inadvertently glamorized lead star. And despite the fact that in the process of dramatizing their narratives, the actual truths may be rewritten or eliminated altogether. As we all know, it doesn't help that these productions will often choose a good-looking, charismatic, fan-favorite actor, teen heartthrobs no less, to portray these, frankly, monstrous people. Even if they are shown to be doing clearly awful things, depending on how this is portrayed, audiences may still find themselves fallible to the halo effect, which could then leave directors with a bit of a dilemma here, because they're then challenged with either displaying the true nature of their crimes and risk coming off as gratuitous, or pull back their punches and risk making the killer seem not as bad as they actually were in real life. Given the alarming social media response to the latest of these projects, it seems that most directors fell back on the latter. There's now a rising trend of fandoms loudly and proudly professing their love and admiration for serial killers, much in due part to their yassification post-biopic, with many thirsting after Evan Peters' portrayal of cannibalistic murderer and offender Jeffrey Dahmer, and some even saying they felt sorry for the killer and that he didn't hurt his victims that bad. Yep, that is a real tweet from a real person. Probably even more insulting was how viewers began shipping Dahmer with one of his victims, with some of them saying, "The most heartbreaking part of the series, Jeff and Tony seemed to be good together. I was hoping they'd fall in love and live happily ever after."
I need help reacting to something.
Then, following the release of the Zac Efron Bundy picture and the Netflix docuseries, The Ted Bundy Tapes, there was then this bizarre trend of TikToks where girls would pretend to get ready for a date with Ted Bundy, coupled with the wave of tweets swooning over how hot they found the real Bundy. I will note that it seems like a lot of people making these posts are young, and whose first real exposure to these serial killers is probably this deluge of true crime production starring their favorite pretty boy, or even worse, the long-standing online communities that have been thirsting after these criminals for ages. Doesn't excuse making content like this, but they're also probably highly impressionable and are hopefully just having some sort of edgy phase. And look, to clarify, I'm definitely not here to rag on Efron or Peters for doing their job. They're incredible actors who played their roles quite well. And all this isn't to say that handsome actors shouldn't be portraying serial killers. His looks, after all, were just one of Bundy's many lures. I also believe that media literacy plays a crucial role here. It isn't the writers or actors' fault if they clearly portrayed a character to be morally questionable and audiences decide to glorify them anyway. But the execution and presentation is what matters here, because really, you can't watch this and tell me that Ted Bundy doesn't come off like some Marvel anti-hero. And don't get me started on the first trailer of the film, or with the upbeat rock music and fast-paced editing, they made him seem like some badass outlaw.
How did his name get on that suspect list?
I mean, just look at the comments on these videos. And the thing is, I'm embarrassed to admit I was one of those people at one point. I love Zac Efron, and I was on board to watch this shit when it came out, and I know exactly what this person was talking about. Media presentation is a powerful thing, especially when you've got a Hollywood dreamboat at the forefront. Meeptop also has a really good video of how the recent Dahmer series on Netflix almost follows the same story beats as Todd Phillips' Joker, making Jeffrey Dahmer almost feel like a sympathetic protagonist. I've also got another bone to pick with Ryan Murphy for how he portrayed Richard Ramirez in American Horror Story, like some bad boy Jason Dean archetype. The real dude smelt like a goat and had rotting teeth, by the way. Not to mention how this affects the families involved in such cases. Often, like with Mindy Pendleton and the I Am a Killer series debacle, they aren't even consulted when companies adapt their stories. Upon the launch of the Dahmer series, Rita Isbell, the sister of one of his victims, spoke up upon the release of the show. She said that neither her nor any of her family members were contacted in any way about it. Apparently, they weren't even told of the show's production and only found out when everybody else did. Yet the creators went on to depict her character in its episodes, complete with the pain and tragedy she had to endure in real life. It was a jarring experience to see herself portrayed by a stranger, to have the distress she displayed in court replicated word for word. In an article for Business Insider, she writes, "If I didn't know any better, I would have thought it was me. Her hair was like mine, she had on the same clothes. That's why it felt like reliving it all over again. It brought back all the emotions I was feeling back then." It wasn't long before another member of her family, Eric Perry, chimed in with his thoughts on Twitter. His statement was blunt, but shines an exposing light on the muddy ethics surrounding this increasingly popular genre. "I know true crime media is huge right now, but if you're actually curious about the victims, my family, the Isbells, are pissed about the show. It's re-traumatizing over and over again, and for what? How many movies, shows, documentaries do we need? They don't notify families when they do this. It's all public record, so they don't have to notify or pay anyone. So when they say they're doing this with respect to the victims or honoring the dignity of the families, no one contacts them. My cousins wake up every few months at this point with a bunch of calls and messages, and they know there's another Dahmer show. It's cruel. And on top of that, they're now gonna have to deal with seeing fanatics excusing these killers or making them out to be hot, brooding, problematic, but supposedly darkly alluring pop culture icons.
I was infatuated with serial killers when I was younger.
Were you?
Mm-hmm. A Q&A with fans, with young fans. It was young fans at the time. It was like, it was with a parent. Someone said, if you could have dinner with anyone living or dead, who would it be? And I was like, oh, you're so cute. Who, mom and dad? Is it okay if I give the real answer? And they were like, sure, I guess. What's the answer? And I was like, I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer's pretty fascinating.
That's insane, dude. That man ate people and their brains.
As I'm editing this video, it's come out that Ryan Murphy has yet again displayed what I can now only describe as his true crime fetish through a new series reenacting another crime case, this time about Lyle and Eric Menendez, who in the 90s were sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of their parents. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this or the show. The case itself had a lot of complications surrounding it. Prosecutors claim they killed to inherit their family's wealth, while their lawyers assert that they were victims of horrid parental abuse. And although the brothers were ultimately sentenced to life, their defense attorney today is apparently working to present new evidence that may just lead to their release. But all that aside, I bring this up because director Ryan Murphy has once again created a sleazy and, weirdly enough, unnecessarily erotic adaptation of an actual tragedy involving actual people. And you heard me right, apparently he decided to depict the brothers in an implied incestuous relationship, which was no more than a mere rumor involving the case. Much like with Dahmer, he also didn't bother to get the consent of or consult with those related to the brothers. Their actual family, in fact, put out a collective statement saying the series is gross, a character assassination, a grotesque shock drama, and ultimately a dishonest, inaccurate portrayal of the real lives involved. One viewer on Twitter aptly wrote, creating incest fanfiction of real-life brothers is insane. So great job, Murphy. I wonder what other traumatic events you'll get your hands on next. But to steer back to the media's and consequently the public's obsession with a serial killer or criminal's physical appeal, or rather overblowing it in most cases, it's fair to wonder whether this attractiveness bias bleeds into the legal system itself. After all, we're only human. Clunky pseudoscience back in the 19th century actually tried to make damning connections between a person's perceived ugliness and their tendency to commit crime. One of the men leading these theories, a Swiss minister by the name of Johann Lavater, argued anyone who strayed from having ideal facial proportions were likely to bear greater traits of weakness or immorality. Thankfully, such claims were largely discredited with time, but researchers did continue to dig into the impact that attractiveness had on criminal sentencing. And while one of the more recent studies to date, a 2024 mock jury experiment conducted by The Conversation, did find that more attractive defendants are likely to be deemed less guilty of murder, the disparity was seen as too insignificant to have any actual effect in the real world. There are, however, stark differences when it comes to race. In a 2023 report published by the United States Sentencing Commission, it was found that Black males received sentences 13.4% longer and Hispanic males received sentences 11.2% longer than white males. This leniency afforded to white male criminals parallels how they've been over-celebritized, glamorized, and even romanticized in general pop culture. In the same way Sibella Nitti was portrayed as animalistic and vicious for a crime she didn't even commit, non-white criminals are hardly granted the same luxury of being humanized or being given the benefit of the doubt by the media. There are exceptions, of course. I did mention Richard Ramirez, who is Mexican, and Jeremy Meeks, who's part African-American. But if we're talking in generalizations here, how often do you see POC serial killers, and plenty more of them do exist? How often do you see them given their own Netflix specials, Hollywood adaptations, and documentaries, granting them a more understanding perspective on their actions and motives, and raising them to an almost rock star-like celebrity status? And not that they should be treated in this way at all. I don't think any serial killer, regardless regardless of race, should be treated like some pop culture icon or movie star. But I think it is worth assessing why those of a predominantly white background are afforded this grace in the first place, whereas those of other races are typically simply labeled as thugs, gangsters, terrorists, or animals. In an interesting op-ed on this phenomenon written by Sharonda J. Brown, they argue that this is the bias that allowed Bundy to evade capture, control the narrative about himself, and project his innocence for so long, and it's the same bias that works to try to convince us that every white mass shooter or domestic terrorist was just misunderstood, a lone wolf, a troubled individual. Let's remember that the judge himself during Bundy's trial felt the need to unnecessarily coddle the guy once the verdict was announced.
You're a bright young man. You made a good lawyer. I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't have any animosity to you. I want you to know that. Take care of yourself. Thank you.
Literal murderer and kidnapper of multiple people. Brown goes on to write that it is the same system of ideas which allows society to ignore crimes against its most marginalized members, those who don't meet societal standards of respectability. Since they also argue that because crime is intraracial, perhaps another reason why most POC criminals stay in obscurity is that they also tend to have victims of color. And historically, at least in the US, Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic victims tend to be underrepresented as murder victims or in missing persons cases, while simultaneously being overrepresented as perpetrators of crime. It doesn't help that a lot of minority neighborhoods also suffer from the stigma of being dangerous or poverty-ridden, leading much of the public to assume, as the Marshall Project puts it, that violence is routine and expected in certain areas, and tragic and newsworthy in others. And the lopsided coverage contributes to a feedback loop, reinforcing this idea that certain neighborhoods are inherently dangerous and unsafe, and others are made up of cousins and sons and mothers. So in short, it seems that Caucasian murderers or serial killers tend to garner the biased infamy they do because their typically middle to upper middle class white victims are deemed more newsworthy, and thus the authorities and spectators have been conditioned to care more about them. As an example, American serial killer Samuel Little got away with murdering 93 women over the span of 35 years. His choice of victims were primarily Black women on the margins of society, those struggling with drug abuse, who had run away from home, who were sex workers. He knew their deaths wouldn't cause as much of a media frenzy or public outrage. In fact, he even bragged about it, saying he avoided targeting, quote, people who would be immediately missed, and that I'm not going to go over there into the white neighborhood and pick out a little teenage girl. Criminologist Scott Bond shares with the Washington Post, if these women had been wealthy, white female socialites, this would have been the biggest story in the history of the United States. But that's not who he preyed upon. He obviously isn't a POC criminal, but it's this bias that also enabled Jeffrey Dahmer to get away with his crimes for so long. Based in the city of Milwaukee, he mainly targeted queer people of color at a time when its police were heavily antagonizing the LGBTQ+ and African American community. This made Black and/or gay Milwaukeeans hesitant to report crimes committed against them or those they knew, and when they did, their case would either be dismissed too quickly, as what happened with Dahmer survivor Ronald Flowers, or their stories were simply not believed. This happened when 14-year-old Conorak Synthosophone actually managed to escape Dahmer's apartment, but was given back to the psycho by the actual police despite Dahmer's African-American neighbors protesting otherwise. In fact, one of them was even threatened with arrest for meddling. To the Dahmer show's credit, it does highlight these injustices, with some viewers applauding it for that particular aspect. But it seems to be a rare positive out of the many reasons why this series was otherwise unnecessary, and a nonetheless grotesque retelling that still caused a disturbing surge in fans of the killer. Social media and pop culture can often make real people feel more like characters in an ongoing drama, and all the more so when they're tied to some status of celebrity or infamy. It makes them feel less tangible and more like entertainment spectacles. We often don't think about the implications of turning these people into quirky cultural icons, conveniently forgetting the atrocities they've committed. It's really quite fascinating in a very dark way that Manson, for example, eventually became a figure a lot of rock artists like to align themselves with. as if he were an image that they thought would make them appear more dangerous, unconventional, or edgy. Alexis Petridis of The Guardian writes, "They frequently seem to be done without any real thought as to what exactly the artist is aligning themselves with, and frequently end in a public apology when said artist is confronted by the reality of what Manson was." One notable instance of this was when Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails established a recording studio in the same estate where Sharon Tate and her friends were murdered. He named it Pig after the message Manson's followers wrote in blood before leaving the scene of crime. And it was only when Reznor encountered Tate's sister that he realized the grotesque nature of his venture. According to his account, she said, "Are you exploiting my sister's death by living in her house?" For the first time, the whole thing kind of slapped me in the face. I said, "No, it's just sort of my own interest in American folklore. I'm in this place where a weird part of history occurred. I guess it never really struck me before, but it did then. She lost her sister from a senseless, ignorant situation that I don't want to support. When she was talking to me, I realized for the first time, what if it was my sister? I thought, F Charlie Manson. I don't want to be looked at as a guy who supports serial killer bullshit." And Manson is just one case. I will reiterate that in a perfect world, we shouldn't be immortalizing any of these killers, in my opinion. And I say in a perfect world because, let's face it, our interest in the macabre, in dissecting the hows, whys, and what-ifs of horrifying tragedies and human psychology isn't going to go away anytime soon. And understanding or digging into the minds of the monsters among us can ultimately be fascinating and insightful. Which is why I want to emphasize that the true crime genre, in and of itself, isn't a bad thing. It can actually have a lot of positives. Research has shown that women, who make up a majority of the fan base, are able to pick up on safety tips or methods of self-defense by educating themselves in these cases. Learning how serial killers work can be both an interesting and eye-opening survival tactic to avoid becoming yet another victim. Then, of course, there's the ability to shine light on the justice system and cultural attitudes that allow awful people to get away with what they do. And there are definitely more helpful and ethical ways of approaching the subject matter than another star-studded Hollywood reenactment that chooses to ignore the input of actual victims. There are podcasts like The Vanished, for instance, that conduct exclusive interviews with the actual friends and family members involved in missing persons cases. By actively including these people in discussions, they can gain a newfound sense of empowerment, a sense of relief that they're finally being heard in their search for justice. Host Marissa Jones highlights this in The Guardian, that true crime as a genre is too often focused on the offender, and many of the families often go unlistened. There was also the 10-episode podcast, Your Own Backyard, created by Chris Lambert, dedicated to the abduction and murder case of Kristen Smart. His series helped Californian authorities track down the two men responsible for the crime, and the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff went on to thank the series for encouraging new witnesses to come forward, which ultimately helped them crack the mystery. And another super cold case, this time in Australia, was finally resolved when the podcast The Teacher's Pet helped renew a widespread interest in the disappearance and supposed murder of Lynette Dawson. The police were eventually able to find her murderer and even stated that the popularity of the podcast was 100% the cause for their fresh investigation. And believe it or not, there are YouTubers that can tackle true crime cases without necessarily having to stuff their face with hot wings or casually do their makeup for the sake of side entertainment. Channels like Ask a Mortician, Lord and Arts, Georgia Marie, and Danelle Hallen, just to name a few, all provide extensive research in their videos as far as I've seen. And I like how there are no unnecessary gimmicks or insufferable comedy thrown in to cheapen the topic at hand, or God forbid, turn the perpetrators into glorified spectacles more than anything else. They seem to handle cases with the sensitivity and victim-focused approach they deserve. It's also really encouraging to see that discussions around true crime online are increasingly calling out its bad practices and bringing awareness to the ways we can better handle such content. And hopefully its culture will continue heading in that direction. I think it's a good thing that we're focusing more on the social injustices and systemic failures that have given criminals their notoriety to begin with. And I can only hope that with this video, I've made a good contribution to the discourse. Thanks for watching this video, guys. It's one of the heavier ones I've had to research for obvious reasons, and involved a lot of careful treading with a lot of the sensitive info involved, but all in all, I do hope I did the topic justice. What are your guys' thoughts on the true crime community and the relatively recent influx of serial killer-centered dramas and entertainment? Do you think the genre is evolving for the better lately, or do you think it's gotten worse? Maybe it's doomed to always have problems? Feel free to share your opinions and discuss in the comments below, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.